Greetings. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Scarlet on Stone Church today and the afternoon. It is almost 5:30. Thank you for being patient with us, and thank you for joining us. We're always blessed by those who want to be a part of this time. I'm sure there are 1,000 things you could probably be doing, even in this COVID locked up world we're in right now, like taking a drive or enjoying the sunset or enjoying something fun. If you're in California, I know some of you aren't. But we thank you for taking the time and to being with us. We hope this time will be a blessing to you. We are working through and spending time with the book of Daniel. Daniel, what a great book this is. And it's a book that we are kind of getting to the end of. But this particular chapter is a chapter that's going to be a 4-part series. We are in part 3 today. So part 3 of chapter 11, we finish chapter 11 next week with the last part, which will be verses 36 to the end of the chapter. Today, we're covering verses 21 through 35. So Daniel 11, verses 21 through 35. That's where we are today. And then next week, we cover the Antichrist, which is going to be verses 36 to the end of the chapter. And then we just march right through into chapter 12, continuing the narrative of the prophecy that Daniel is being given in this chapter. As you may know, really chapter 11 is an extension of chapter 10. It is the revelation that God's giving to Daniel that began in chapter 10. We're now moving through very specific details of chapter 11, the details of history, the details that encompass future kingdoms, future tyrants or kings, you could say, future men that are going to be ravishing and plundering and trying to establish their own power. And in chapter 11, there was a lot of names we've covered. And I have to thank every one of you if you actually put any time into our study and actually put up with me with all the various different kings I had to tell you. Today, that's going to be limited greatly because we don't have a lot to focus on. We're focusing primarily on one particular king. Now, I've said before, you don't have to memorize all the different kings. There are 4 particular characters you need to remember in this chapter. If you forget all the kings, the names, don't worry about them. Just 4 you have to think about, or just remember when you come back to chapter 11, if you ever do. I'm hoping you will. It's the Bible, the Word of God. But if you do come back to chapter 11 in your own reading, in your own studies, remember 4 names. Number 1 would be Xerxes I. That's the first king, Xerxes I. And he's known in Esther as Ahasuerus, but he's Xerxes I. And from that, he is the first king you want to remember. He's the king that takes over the power of the other 3. He's the more powerful of the 4 kings of Persia. So that's the one king. The second king you want to know about is in verse 4 of chapter 11, which is Alexander the great world military tactician, the greatest military conqueror of all of history. Ruling from Europe to India, Alexander the Great. We know that name. We've all studied him in history classes in school, but it's a name that is represented by the actions of the king that Daniel talks about, the king of Greece. His death, of course, Alexander's death, takes the Grecian Empire and divides it into 4 directions. I am not going to tell you all the names. Just remember that of the 4 different directions, there is a war between the north and the south. The kings of the east and the west don't really have much to do with chapter 11, but the kings of the north and the south do. The Seleucid kings of the north and the Ptolemaic kings of the south. And there's sort of this back and forth seesaw effect between wars of each other. Lots of kings are mentioned in this area. Only one you need to know, and that is Antiochus III the Great. Antiochus III the Great. He covers basically verses 10 through verse 20 of chapter 11. So, Xerxes I, Alexander the Great, Antiochus III the Great. Then we come to the king today, and that king is the successor, the usurper would be the better way of saying it, the usurper Antiochus IV Epiphanes. That name you need to know. You need to know that name. Why? Because what he does is symbolic of what the Antichrist will do in our future. His actions are a precursor. His actions are a type of what the Antichrist, the man of sin, is going to do in his exact actions when he comes on the scene in our future. Not just Daniel's future, but even our present day future. I'm sure you know, you've heard, you're aware of the name Antichrist. That man goes by various names. He's called the beast in Revelation. Paul calls him the man of sin or the son of perdition. He's also known, of course, as the Prince of Persia in one aspect, but also he's also known as the Antichrist. And John, that is the Apostle John, in his letter, 1 John, and through his letters, he addresses him there as that name. Interestingly, you may not know this, but hopefully you do, the word Antichrist is not mentioned anywhere in Revelation. He's only mentioned in the epistles of John. So that man, that character we've grown up to hear about, is going to be a man in the future. And Antiochus Epiphanes is a man we're going to read about in verses 21 through 35, who is going to basically be a model, a type, a precursor of who the Antichrist will be. Now, you may be asking, am I going to be talking about the Antichrist? Well, yes, I'm going to be, starting at verse 36, going on to the rest of chapter 11, but that will come at next week, not this week. But there's a lot to say about this particular man. So the four kings you need to know, here they are again: Xerxes I, Alexander the Great, Antiochus III the Great, and then Antiochus IV Epiphanes. If you forget any other name, it doesn't matter. Having said that, those are the names you need to know. If you don't remember them, that's okay. That's okay. There are no quizzes here. I should have quizzes. I'm sure many of you want me to give you quizzes. People do well with quizzes, but I'm tempted to do it, but I won't. Okay, so that's the introduction. Now let's get into the text, and then I'm going to explain as we go, because when you read the text, you're not going to understand exactly what's all happening, because Daniel is not mentioning the names. He's giving us the actions of what the kings will do. So you may be asking, well, Pastor Craig, how is it that you know what's going to be happening? How do you know these names? Well, all you have to do is be a student of history. If you understand the Seleucid kings, or the Seleucid kings, and the Ptolemaic kings of history, and you know their actions, they fit exactly into the paradigm, into the schema of what Daniel is saying. Now, from Daniel's perspective, he doesn't know any of this. He doesn't know. He's not lived it. This is all future for him. This is all future in his mind. So when we get to the time of Xerxes, we're moving in time, 50, 60, 70 years in history. By the time we get to Antiochus Epiphanes, which is where we are now, in verse 21, hold your seatbelts, we are over 300 years away from Daniel. To put this in perspective, imagine if you were living in the 1730s. Just imagine that. And imagine that God gives you a word about America. And he gives you what's going to be happening. He tells you, and basically 40 some years from now, there's going to be a Declaration of Independence. Oh, and there's going to be a war to secure that Declaration of Independence. Oh, by the way, there's going to be a civil war 130 years later. Oh, by the way, there's going to be, past that, there's going to be a World War I and then a World War II. It'll be astounding to know there have been someone who was prophesying America's future hundreds of years. But in order to do that, you'd have to have been alive in the 1730s in relation to where Daniel is in fulfillment of Antiochus Epiphanes is here, or well over 300 years. Now, I hope that provides perspective. Now, let's get right into the text. So, chapter 11, verse 21 is where we're beginning. And here's what it says. And in his estate shall stand up a vile person, to whom shall not give the honor of the kingdom, but he shall come in peaceably and obtain the kingdom by flatteries. Okay, what does that mean? Well, at the very beginning, and in his estate, we have to tell you a little bit here that I told you one of the most important kings we need to learn about as we got through, we already covered him, is Antiochus III the Great. What happened to him? Well, he died. He died trying to plunder the temples of Elam. And in doing so, he was killed by his own people. So what happened? Well, the Seleucid kingdom, the kingdom of the north, had two brothers. Seleucus IV and Antiochus IV. But Antiochus IV was king. He's the one who had the heir to the throne because he was the older. And in verse 20, we learn that he was taxed heavily. Why was he taxed heavily? Because his father, Antiochus III, don't care about the names, don't worry about the names, but Antiochus III tried to wage war against Rome. Rome is a growing republic. It's not an empire yet, but it is a fully established republic. It doesn't become an empire until the days of Octavius around 30 BC, but it is a republic and it has an empire itself. It is a growing military that is a major threat to the east, that is to any nation that's on the eastern side of the Mediterranean, assuming obviously Syria and Egypt. So with that said, what happened is Antiochus III ends up losing some battles against Rome, the Grecian islands, and parts of Asia Minor. So Rome taxes him. So when Antiochus dies, that tax doesn't end. And that tax is levied against the Seleucid Empire, and Seleucus IV is in control. But what happens is he ends up taxing the people of Judea, that is the Jews. They're taxed. Well, Seleucus has a prime minister, and this prime minister has some ideas, some plans, and he wants to take control. So basically, he poisons Seleucus IV, and he dies. So who's left? Antiochus is dead. His son Seleucus is dead, died by poisoning. Who's left? Well, who's left are three people. Demetrius, Seleucus' son. Okay. Antiochus, a baby, not Antiochus the bad guy, but a baby, Seleucus' younger son. And then Antiochus Epiphanes, the bad guy we're going to be talking about, who is not in Syria at the time of Seleucus' death. I hope you're following along with me. So what's happened here? Antiochus is on a campaign somewhere outside of Syria. He comes back to Antioch acting as regent executor of helping little Antiochus, the little baby, come into power. Well, I mentioned another son, Demetrius. Where's he? Well, he's in Rome as a prisoner. Why is he in a prisoner? Because he's the collateral for the taxes Rome is levying upon the Seleucid Empire. So if they don't pay, Demetrius dies. That's the collateral. So he can't get out of Rome, and the Seleucid empires have taxes. Now I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, didn't you just tell us you weren't going to give us all these names? This is where the names kind of stop. So after this point, we focus on the rise of Antiochus. So what does he do? Antiochus, the brother, the younger brother, comes in, and he comes and wants to groom the little Antiochus to become ruler, but he doesn't want Seleucid's son, Antiochus, to be ruler. So what did he do? He comes back to the Seleucid Empire, and with flatteries and intrigue and squeezing and squirming his way, he gets to the top. So therefore, Seleucus' son, Antiochus, is basically pushed aside, easily because he's a child. He's a young little baby. Demetrius is in Rome. He can't come either. So it's not a very hard thing to imagine that Seleucus' brother, Antiochus, becomes king, and so he does. And that's where verse 21 begins. And in his estate, that's in the state of Seleucus, who's dead, shall stand a vile person. Now, Antiochus, ladies and gentlemen, is vile. He's sick vile. Many people, many of the contemporaries of Antiochus Epiphanes did not call him Antiochus Epiphanes. They called him Antiochus Epimanes. And the word Epimanes means maniac, lunatic, madman. That's how Antiochus was looked at. And we're going to learn about this madness, this lunacy of his life as we begin to go through these verses. So he comes into power, and when he does, he gives himself the name Epiphanes, which means glorious one, or that which is representing the shining forth of deity. In other words, Antiochus Epiphanes wants to be viewed as a god. He wanted to be looked at as a god. Therefore, Antiochus IV Epiphanes, of the Lord, glory of the God. And therefore, he wanted to have the glory and be looked at as the glory. That's the first stage of the connection between what this man is and the Antichrist who is to come. Another connection between this man and the future Antichrist is the flattery part. The Antichrist is going to come into power. The real Antichrist, the future Antichrist, will come into power not by war. If you read Revelation chapter 6, you'll see a rider is on a white horse who has a bow. But on the bow is missing something. What's it missing, old Bible students? It's missing the arrows. He's not going to come to power through war. He's going to come to power through intrigue, through flattery, through rising in political position. That's how the Antichrist will come. And he will come in such a way where people will not expect him. Antiochus Epiphanes comes into power unexpectedly. Seleucus is dead. The expectation is Demetrius, or the little baby of Seleucus named Antiochus, not the brother. And because of that, what you're finding is that he comes into power out of nowhere. And he comes into power in intrigue and in flattery. This is exactly how the Antichrist will come into power. Okay, so that's just giving you a taste of, as we move into the verses, what's going to be happening here. So he comes in peaceably, comes into power, and seizes control and gives himself the name Epiphanes. Now, verse 22, and with the arms of a flood shall they be overflown from before him, and shall be broken, yea, also the prince of the covenant. What happens here is that Antiochus basically does what his fathers and his forefathers are doing before him. Antiochus is the 8th ruler of the Seleucid dynasty. So the question I have to ask is, what have the Seleucid kings been doing all these years? What have they been up to? Well, here's what they've been up to, old Bible students. They've been up to warring against Egypt. So, in like manner and in like stead, Antiochus does what all the other rulers of the Seleucid Empire have done: wage war with Egypt. That's what they do. So he goes against Egypt with a flood. That's the term flood here. And as he does, he basically has great victories. And when he comes back from the victories, he stops by Judea. Notice why. I should ask the question, why is Israel, or I should say, why is Daniel being given this message, or why is he given this prophecy when he's not a Seleucid and he's not Ptolemaic? He's not in the Egyptian world and he's not the Assyrian. What's this have to do with Israel? What's any of this have to do with, is it about other kings, Gentile kings that are actually warring against each other? So what's this all about here? Well, what's it about is Israel is the land from which these kings are trodden. They are walking upon, they are ruling, they are plundering. So as the Seleucid kings of the north fight against the south, they are trotting on, tampering over, stealing, controlling in every way Israel. So what Daniel's being received here is, this is the future of Israel. They're going to be purged. They're going to be trampled upon. They're going to be basically looked at and being controlled by these warring Gentile kings. So in verse 22, Antiochus comes back from Egypt with the spoils, but he stops by Israel as usual, and he wants to basically cause havoc. So what happens here in verse 22? It says, they shall be overflown from before him and shall be broken, yea, also the prince of the covenant. In other words, he comes back, and the prince of the covenant is referring to the high priest. History has already made this clear. The language is clear in the text. Is referring to the high priest. The high priest is Onias III. That's the high priest. You don't need to remember his name. What you need to know is Antiochus dethroned him and killed him, and replaced him with Onias III's brother named Jason. And Jason takes over and basically becomes the ruling high priest over, in this case, Israel. That's the history there. Now, in that respect, he takes him over, and Jason is willing to become a man who does what Antiochus wants. Onias was a man of the law. He did not want to be and fall into the heathen practices, but Jason does. And because of it, he becomes a sort of an apostate Jew high priest. Okay, now, moving right along. So, verse 23, and after the league made with him, he shall work deceitfully, for he shall come up and shall become strong with a small people. That is, when Antiochus gets Jerusalem, he will have a league, a relationship, an alliance with apostate Jews who agree with him. So as Israel is fighting for its life and still trying to engage in the practices of the Mosaic law, there are Jews that are willing to go to the Gentile world. They're willing to adopt Gentile practices. Antiochus is recognizing this, and he knows, if I can have enough of them on my side, I can make them into a little army that will control Israel and will be able to be used when I have other wars that I want to wage against Egypt. So that's the background that's happening here. Now we come to verse 24. And he shall enter peaceably even upon the fattest places of the province, and he shall do that which his fathers have not done, nor his fathers. He shall scatter among them the prey and the spoil and the riches. Yea, he shall he shall forecast his devices against strongholds, even for a time. What does all that mean? What it means simply is this. Antiochus, as he engages in his military campaigns, does something that his forefather kings of the Seleucid Empire did not do. What does he do? He shares in the spoils, in the plunder with the people. He wants to get the people on their side. How does he do that? By giving them portions of the riches he takes from Egypt. So as he comes from Egypt, not only does he make alliances with the apostate Jews, not only does he make alliances with other people groups to maybe use them as his subjects when he wishes, but he wants to win them over to devotion to him when the time is right. So this is something his forefathers, Antiochus III, did not do. Seleucus II did not do that, or Seleucus III did not do that. A lot of the former kings did not, but this king does. And so Antiochus makes relationships. He makes relationships with everybody. He doesn't just pick and choose. He really wants to connect. He's strategizing. He's creating all the different buffer groups that he needs in order to secure his ultimate control. And what is his ultimate control? To secure Egypt forever under the Seleucid Empire. That's what he wants. That dynasty of the north is to control the south in his heart. So what does he do? He gives away the goods to all the people around him. But then it says at the end of verse 24, It says, and he shall forecast his devices against strongholds even for a time. What this means is that he establishes garrisons of troops nearer the Egyptian border, which are called strongholds, so that when he invades again, he will not have trouble in those gated areas. So he needs to not only have people that will support him, that's by giving away all the riches, giving the goods, redistributing the wealth in Marxist terms, you could say. But unfortunately, like a drug cartel, he makes friends with the neighbors and makes friends with everyone, gives them all the goodies they want, so they will protect him when the time is right. And so what he does is then he establishes little garrisons of soldiers through and near Egypt so that when he invades again, he will not be blocked by certain routes that he would like to take. Yes, that's what verse 24 means, ladies and gentlemen. And you're like, wow, that's a lot of meaning there, but that's what the text means. Now, verses 25 through 27 are the campaigns and wars against Egypt. That would be an outline for you. Verses 21 through 24 is the rise and deception of Antiochus. He is going to rise and deceive the people. That's what we've covered just now. Now we're going to move into what he's doing. He's created his buffer. He's created the people groups to support him. He's also created the inroads that will lead him to victory militarily by the garrisons that are now creating the strongholds that are in his favor. So now verses 25 through 27 are now his campaigns, his second and third campaigns against Egypt. So let's read what they say. Verse 25, and he shall stir up his power, his courage against the king of the south. That means Antiochus, king of the north, is now going to wage war against king of the south with a great army. And the king of the south shall be stirred up to battle with a very great and mighty army, but he shall not stand. For they shall forecast devices against him. Yea, verse 26, they that feed of the portion of his meat shall destroy him, and his army shall overflow, and shall many fall down slain. What's happening here? Very simply this. Antiochus has done his work very well. Now remember, everything I'm telling you about this crazy lunatic man that most history has forgotten is going to be a type of the actions of the Antichrist. This is why you don't want to not know his name. Antiochus IV Epiphanes is a lunatic, evil, possessed, demonically possessed man. This guy is sick, and we're going to learn how sick he is in a moment. But the Antichrist is going to do exactly what he does. Now, it doesn't mean that the Antichrist is going to go against Egypt specifically, but his rise to power and his ability to create relationships and alliances, knowing that he has a plan to do something, is the actions that the Antichrist will copy. So the Antichrist in verses 25, Antiochus in verses 25 through 26 did his work very well. What did he do? He made friendships. He got along with everyone. He was like a Robin Hood. He was like a Santa Claus, giving all the gifts away, being a friendly guy. But he's also a demon, because what he wants to do is he wants now to take and destroy everyone. So he makes the alliances. He does what he needs to do. And by his alliances, he has been able to bribe. He's been able to whisper deceits in the military leaders of the king of the south, Ptolemy. And Ptolemy IV is going to be, or in this case, Ptolemy V is going to be deceived. His own military is going to turn on him. They're going to deceive him. So that's what it said here. And we read verse 26. It says, or at the very end of verse 25, it says, and very great and mighty army, but he shall not stand, for they shall forecast devices against him, plans, deceit. intrigue against who? The king of the south, his own men. And in verse 26, and they that feed of the portion of his meat. It means the very people the king of the south feeds, his own people are going to rise up and in league with Antiochus Epiphanes, they're going to deceive the king and overthrow him. That is what's happening so far. Now, that king is overthrown and loses. And what happens in verse 27, it says that many shall fall down slain. So because of the deceit, many of the Egyptians' king's army, the Ptolemy's armies, will fall and die. Verse 28. Here we go. Or verse 27. And both these kings' hearts shall be to do mischief, and they shall speak lies at one table, but it shall not prosper. For yet the end shall be at the time appointed. Now, what this means is that there's going to be a meeting between Antiochus Epiphanes and Ptolemy IV Philometor. Now, don't worry about Philometor. That is going to be one of there are two brothers here in the king's world of the south. So he's defeated. That is, Ptolemy IV Philometor is defeated. He meets with the king at the table. And at this table, they lie to each other. They make a supposed agreement. Antiochus wants to control everything. Ptolemy IV wants to be able to find a way to control his own brother and consolidate power in Egypt for his own gain. And what the Bible is telling us, what the text is saying, is that they're going to lie to each other, but this lying is not going to prosper. They're not going to get what they want, either in the south or in the north. And it says, and the reason they're not going to is because nothing is going to pass until the appointed time. Now, when you read that in verse 27, not until the appointed time, what that means is nothing's going to happen without God's timing. God is appointed the time in which these kings will either fail or these kings will not have their plans go through, and the time being appointed is not going to happen until he does it. So God's in control. A little statement of God's sovereignty in this statement here. Antiochus is not in control of his own destiny, nor is Ptolemy IV Philometor. They are not in control. They think that they are, but they're not. And that's one of the reasons why Daniel's getting this prophecy. It is God revealing to Daniel, here is what is going to happen, and it's going to happen as God's word has said it would happen. Now, verse 28. Verse 28 through 35 is the desolation of Israel, the Holy Land. Verses 28 through 35. This is the crux of the verse we're going to read. This is the section, the key, the focus of what we're going to learn about regarding Antiochus Epiphanes, this vile madman lunatic. So, what happens in verse 28? Then he, that is Antiochus Epiphanes, will return into his land with great riches. He has just defeated Egypt. His second campaign against Egypt has just been done. He comes back with riches. He thinks in his mind he has fooled Ptolemy IV Philometor that they have an agreement. Antiochus wants absolute control of Egypt. He thinks he's going to get it. He comes with riches, and he comes, as always, trampling over the Holy Land. So here it says in verse 28, then he shall return into the land with great riches, and his heart shall be against the holy covenant. That means he's against Israel. The holy covenant is Israel. The prince of the covenant is the high priest. The holy covenant is Israel. And it says here, and he shall do exploits and return to his own land. Well, what does he do? Well, this is not going to be yet the abomination of desolation we're going to get to. That's going to come in a moment. What he does is he goes into the temple, and because the eye is never satisfied, he wants more goodies. He comes back from Egypt as victor, and he wants more goodies. And what happens? He takes implements and vessels and plunders the temple. That's what he does. And in this point here, he comes and he basically is going to plunder the temple, and he's going to put down any rebellion against him. Well, it turned out there is a revolt, a rebellion against Antiochus. Because of the revolt that's going on with the Jews there, Antiochus hates the Jews that want to follow God. So as he goes there, he then plunders and does a emptying out of the temple. And then from that, he comes back into Egypt. So that is what verse 28 is. And then it says, what we have here at verse 29, so he returns to his own land. And then at verse 29, at the time appointed, he shall return and come toward the south, but it shall not be as the former or as the latter. Now remember, Antiochus has made all kinds of alliances in Judea, that is the land of Israel. He's made all kinds of alliances, and he expects that every time he goes through Jerusalem, every time he comes into Israel, he's going to have people on his side. He does not like it when he finds out that there are those who are staying with the law and rebelling. So what happens is that what's going to go on is that there's going to be now a new war, a third campaign against the south. Antiochus doesn't like not being at war. He has enough riches, but he wants full control. He now knows his alliances are set up. He's already squashed rebellion in Israel already in Jerusalem on the way back up. He's taken care of that problem in his mind, and now he's ready to full-fledged war against Egypt. But what it says in verse 29 is very insightful. It says this, and at the appointed time, he shall return. That means he shall go back to the south and come toward the south. But it shall not be as former or as in former times. What does that mean? Antiochus has had victory 2 times already. And what the text is saying is, this time it won't be victory. In verse 30, for the ships of Kittim shall come against him, therefore he shall be grieved and return and have indignation against the holy covenant. So shall he do, he shall even return and have intelligence with them that forsake the holy covenant. What is this all about? Let me explain it to you. It says here in verse 30, for the ships of Kittim shall come against Antiochus. Well, it turns out that the kings of the south, their 2 brothers, Ptolemy Euergetes and Ptolemy IV Philometor, these 2 brothers have reconciled, apparently. And these 2 brothers have called on the Republic of Rome for help. So what Antiochus did not know is that as he was going south to conquer Egypt, there was a fleet of Roman ships headed into the Mediterranean towards Alexandria, which is North Africa, towards right near Egypt. And this Roman fleet goes and ends up at Alexandria to meet Antiochus and his army. Antiochus did not recognize this, did not realize this. And because he did not realize this, he was taken by surprise, because all of the setup that he had already provided, all the goodies he'd provided for getting this victory won so quickly, were now being usurped by Rome. Now remember, Antiochus understands the power of Rome, because the power of Rome conquered his father, and Rome demanded 1,000 talents for payment of taxes because of his father's loss to Rome. So Rome was weighing taxes against them. And therefore Antiochus knew that Rome is not someone you want to play with. Remember, this is long before the empire. Where are we in the schema of things? Right now, we're in about 176 right now. I can't say that. About 169 BC. That's where we are. Rome becomes an empire in 30 BC, and we have it as a republic now. But it is a strong, growing empire. Antiochus does not want to meddle with Rome right now. They're too powerful for his interests. So they meet him. And that stops everything, because what happens is when he meets him, there is a potential little man. There's a commander. And this commander, his name is Opelius Lamus, or Lamus. And Opelius Lamus is the commander of the Roman fleets. And he meets Antiochus personally. And in meeting Antiochus personally, he tells him basically this: we are in league with Egypt. It is our region now. We're in control of that region now. So you are not to disturb Egypt ever. If you do, we will destroy you. So what happened is, in Roman style, you can say, Opelius drew a circle in the sand of the desert, a circle around Antiochus. They drew a circle around him and said, you have a choice. You either go against Egypt and you fight against us and war against us and Egypt, or you leave us alone forever. And when you make your decision, step out of the circle. You don't make a decision until you step out of the circle. And so therefore, if you step out of the circle, you know exactly what you're going to be doing. You know exactly what's going to be happening. So in that set is when you make the decision, you step out. Until you make the decision, don't step out. So Antiochus recognized he was beaten. So he steps out of the circle begrudgingly, and he goes back north. So he doesn't get the kingdom he wanted. So everything he worked for, all the alliances he wanted, were all breaking down in front of him, because he knows that if Rome controls Alexandria, then he can't go back to Egypt again. And the alliances of the south, that is alliances between Egypt and Syria, will break down, because they know there's a new kid on the block, a new power on the street that is going to be a contender. And they may then want to have allegiance with Rome now. That is, people in Judea. So Antiochus comes up back to his homeland enraged. And where does that anger come from? Where does that enragement focus on? Right on Israel. And he comes back, and here's what happens. Verse 31. And the arms shall stand, or I should say, before I do that, let me read the end of verse 30 just really fast. So I'll read verse 30 again. Just now that I've said everything, it'll make sense. For the ships of Kittim, that is from Cyprus. Kittim is Cyprus, and Rome controlled Cyprus. And therefore the ships of Kittim are referring to Cyprus. For the ships of Cyprus shall come against him, therefore he shall be grieved and return. And he's back to Egypt, or back to Syria, and have indignation against the holy covenant, that is against Israel. He's so mad. All that anger is being focused demonically on the people that he knows he can destroy. He wants to kill people. He's in a mood and he can't do it. And Rome stopped him from killing lots of people. But he doesn't want us. He wants to kill people. So who does he go to? He goes to Israel. And then so shall he do. He shall even return to, or have intelligence with them that forsake the holy covenant. In other words, he goes back to Israel. He wants to get a war going with them. And he basically remembers, he calls the number of all the apostate Jews that want to side with him. Why? Because he wants to kill everyone else that will not side with him. Now, verse 31. So how does he do it? How does he kill? How does he wreck? How does he destroy Jerusalem? Verse 31. And arms shall stand on his part, and they shall pollute the sanctuary of strength, and shall take away the daily sacrifice, and they shall place the abomination that makes desolate. So verse 31 is a very important verse in the Bible, because Jesus himself talks about this very thing. And that's in Matthew chapter 24. We'll get to that more when we talk about the Antichrist. But in describing the Antichrist, there is an action here that the Antichrist will do that's identical to what Antiochus IV Epiphanes does right here. And what does he do? Well, first it says here that the arm shall stand on his part. That is, he will send troops. He will send arms. That is, he will send his military to the temple. And what does the military do at the temple? What they do is they stop the sacrifices. It says here, they shall take away the daily sacrifices. They shall also pollute the sanctuary. They will stop all worship of God. They will stop all activity that the priests will do, and they will kill anyone who is worshiping. That is what the armed men do. So they will kill all worshipers. This happens, by the way, on a Sabbath. It happens 167 BC. And on this Sabbath, this day, this Saturday, this day of worship, they come in and they kill everyone worshiping, because Antiochus knows anyone worshiping on the Sabbath is against him. And therefore what they do is they take away the people, they slaughter the children, they slaughter the women. And then what they do is they forbid all worship. They forbid all sacrifice. Antiochus then forces the priests of the temple to slay a pig and then to spread its blood all over the Holy of Holies. And then he forces the priests to eat the pork. He takes the insides of the pig and spreads it around the temple, or the insides of the temple. He tells the people that are Jews they have a choice. You have a choice to die, or you have a choice to be involved in orgies, drunken orgies, in which you will defile yourselves, and you will do the orgies in honor to Bacchus. So you have a choice: defile yourself in your spiritual self, or die. Either way, they're going to kill you. That's how they probably looked at it. But therefore, they gave every Jew that choice that they did not kill first. The men were given that choice to either defile their bodies in drunken stupors and to be looked at as just an implement for worship of Bacchus, or they were to be killed on the spot. And of course, the abomination itself, the actual key abomination is he brought in a statue of Zeus. And he puts Zeus into the Holy of Holies, as it ends up being now the worship, and forces all of the Jews to worship Zeus. And he forces the Jews to do all these things. He forced the Jews to put the statue of Zeus on the Holy of Holies. He forces the Jewish priests to kill and slay the pig on the altar. He forces the Jewish priests to eat the pork of the pig, and he forces them to do all of the defilements. And that is what verse 31 does. That's what it's all saying right there. So, and the arms shall stand on his part, and they shall pollute the sanctuary of strength. They shall take away the daily sacrifice, and they shall place the abomination that makes desolate, the abomination of desolations. Jesus says this is going to happen. Paul says it's going to happen. The abomination of desolation is going to come. It's a future event. Now, what's so interesting is that to many Jews, when they read Daniel, they believe that the abomination of desolation had already happened 160, or in this case, about 200 years by the time Jesus came. It happened already 200 years before. But when Jesus spoke of it as a future event, and when Paul deals with it, it is a surprise to the Jews. Because they're like, wait a minute, this already happened. What are you saying? It's going to happen again? But it's going to happen again. And we're going to talk a lot about the abomination of desolation next time in relation to the Antichrist, because we're going to deal with that part. But this act, this moment in time is a type, a foreshadowing of what the Antichrist is going to do. He's going to defile the temple. And the temple was defiled by Antiochus IV Epiphanes, and it was defiled on 167 BC. So, then verse 32, and such as do wickedly against the covenant shall be corrupt by flatteries. In other words, the apostate Jews who do what this king wants will be brought by flatteries, but the people that do know their God shall be strong and take action. Ladies and gentlemen, we've learned in Romans chapter 11, did not Paul say that the Jewish people in every generation will have a remnant? Did not Jeremiah, was he not also told that too? There's always going to be a remnant in the Jewish community. And in this very dark, evil, disgusting, horrid time, there's a remnant. and the remnant is there. There are those apostates that serve Antiochus, and then there are those that don't. Now you say, well, they were going to be killed. Yes, but there was a lot of them. And as they're being killed, there were still many before they were killed that were fighting, that desired to teach the other Jews to come back to the true worship of God. And so it says in verse 32 that though there are many who do wickedly against the covenant, that means they're apostate Jews who are wicked against their own worship of God, they've now defiled themselves with Antiochus. There shall be people that do know their God, that will not turn and will be strong and do exploits, which means to take action. But verse 33, and they, that is those who are good Jews who are focusing on worshiping God, and they that understand among the people shall instruct many. In other words, they're going to turn the hearts of many back to the worship of God. Does that sound familiar to any of you who know the book of Revelation? I.e., hello, 144,000? How about the two witnesses? That's Revelation 11 or Revelation 7 and then Revelation chapter 11 with the two witnesses. You find that even in this dark time, there's going to be, you could say, an evangelism of sorts of Jews who will be sharing and getting people to come back. And here it says in verse 32 or 33, they shall instruct many, yet they shall fall by the sword, by flame, and by captivity, and by spoil for many days. This is a long-term invasion, a long-term. 2,300 days were the days that were prescribed for Antiochus Epiphanes and his entire reign. So if you go from 171 to the killing of Ananias, the high priest, to his death, and Antiochus Epiphanes dies in 164. Okay? That range of time is about 2,300 days based on the ancient calendars, not our Gregorian calendars, but the ancient calendars. And that time frame is given us at the very end of chapter 7. And then we learn about the number of days that are brought in there. And in those time frames, here we have this engagement, this campaign against Israel. There's going to be those who bring in they share the word of God. They get people who would be apostate to come to worship God. But then it says that they shall what? That they shall die. They shall be killed. And it gives the modes of their death. It says here that they will die by the sword, or by fire, or by captivity, and by plunder, spoil or plunder, many days. Verse 34, listen carefully to this. Now when they shall fall, they shall be helped with a little help. Now the word holden there, if you have an or holpen, is the word help. Granted a little help. But many shall cleave to them with flatteries. What does verse 34 mean? It means that during this very dark time, there's going to come a rebellion. If you understand, I've ever learned about Hanukkah, you will know what I'm talking about. Judas Maccabeus, the Hasidic Jew, who himself created a revolt against Antiochus Epiphanes' troops in Israel, happened. And this revolt, this guerrilla warfare that existed, pushed back the Syrians and allowed the cleansing of the temple to come. This is predicted by this little phrase, and help will come a little bit. Why does it say a little bit? Because this victory was not permanent. This victory was only for a little bit, for a little time. Syria would control again at some future point. Rome would come in and control at a certain point. It was not a long-term victory, but nonetheless, it was a victory. The Maccabean victory of Judas Maccabeus one of the 5 sons of Theudas Maccabeus, came with his brother, and they created the revolt that pushed back and was able to bring the temple to be cleansed. And every Jew in the world today celebrates Hanukkah because of that event. Why is it called? Well, why is it Hanukkah? Because on the candle, you have the 8 little leaves of the candle, and on those leaves there's 8 lights, and you light those lights, and those lights represent each day in which the temple was lighted by the power of God in order for them to then be able to cleanse the temple from all of the abomination that was in it, and to cleanse it from the troops and all of the Gentileness that had corrupted and the evil that had corrupted their practice in the temple. That is the sort of the genesis of Hanukkah. So that is celebrated to this day. And that goes back to the days in which you had Judas Maccabeus pushing back. And it's prophesied right here in verse 34 that those good Jews who would teach and bring the possible apostate Jews back into faith, they themselves would be conquered, beat, persecuted, killed by Antiochus. But within this group that were surviving somehow, there was a guerrilla group, and they pushed him back. Now, Judas Maccabeus not only pushed back, but he dealt swiftly, very bloodily with the apostate Jews. He killed them brutally for all the Jews that sided with Antiochus. So though this power was to be subsided for a while, anyone who sided with Antiochus was dealt with very, very harshly. Then, verse 35. And some of them, understanding, shall fall to try them and to purge and to make them white, even to the time of the end, because it is not yet a time appointed. Now, what I want to do is I want to read 34 and 35 together. Just full context, you can get the whole verse together. Let me put that together. So verse 34, now when they shall fall, they shall be aided with a little help, but many shall cleave to them with flatteries. That is, there will be many of the apostate Jews who will be flattered and wanting to just hold on and push away judgment from Judas Maccabeus to say, oh yes, I'm on your side. I never was a bad guy, but this is not going to last. And some of them, verse 35, of understanding, that is, those who know the truth, shall fall to try them and to purge and to make them white, even to the time of the end, because it is yet for a time appointed. What this all means is that as Antiochus was pushed out for a time, there's going to be a purging of those who are really on God's side against those who are really or not on God's side. If you're truly on God's side, you will be on one side. If you're not, you'll be purged. And the purge existed through the work of Antiochus and his persecutions of the Jews, plus Judas Maccabeus and his persecution of the apostate Jews. But then it says something else at the very end of verse 5, and then we're done. And that's this. It says, and to make them white even to the time of the end, because it is yet for a time appointed. What Daniel is telling us is very simply this. This time frame is not it. Daniel is being told by basically God in the prophecy, you think that the 70 years of captivity through Babylon and Persia is it. No. It's not going to be it. What's going to happen is the Jews will not be under Darius. The Jews will also be under 4 other kings. And then they'll be trodden under Alexander the Great. And then they'll be trodden under Antiochus III the Great. And then they'll be trodden under Antiochus IV Epiphanes. And after that, the purging will continue because the time is not yet. What Daniel's being told is that the Jews as a people are going to be purged from that time of Daniel right here, from this verse, from the abomination of desolation, from that time to now, today, 2020, to the time until the kingdom comes. The Jews are going to be a purged group. A purging is not going to end for them. If you wonder why the Jews have been persecuted all these 2,000 years, it's more than that, of course. But since the end of the canon of Scripture, it's because they're purging and fulfilling this prophecy that God is refining those Jews within their community that will worship Him in spirit and in truth. And that is why it says the word white, to be pure. There's always going to be a remnant throughout time of the Jews that will worship God and see the truth of who He is, and through His Son Jesus. The sad thing that Daniel is hearing, though, is that until the kingdom comes, the Jews will be purged. They will be persecuted. Now, that's God's perspective in the purging. Why? Because of the sins that they committed as a nation. Israel was as wicked could be in the past. All you have to do is read. And God, through the prophets, warned them over and over again, if you continue, you will be judged by God. And they did not listen for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. And everything that Moses prophesied at the end of Deuteronomy in regard to what would happen to them, all that God prophesied to Abraham when He made the covenant with Abraham that the people would be enslaved at some point due to their disobedience, was all being fulfilled. And what has happened is happening in Daniel's perspective. He's now seeing, oh no, and this is going to continue. Having said all that, Daniel's being given this truth. The purging is going to continue. The persecutions will continue. Not with the end of Antiochus. It will continue. Now, what's the takeaway from this? The abomination of desolation, an act by a king, will be done again. Next week, we're going to start verse 36 and go all the way to the end of the chapter. It's now going to give us the exploits, the activities of the final king of Rome, the final king of a revived Roman Empire, the final world ruler, the son of perdition, the man of sin, the man of lawlessness, the beast, the Antichrist, who is going to follow in the footsteps of Antiochus. And he's going to do the same things that he did. And he is a model, and we're going to read about him next time. So you don't want to miss it. It's all coming to a climax there next week. So without further ado, let's close in prayer. Father, we come before you and we pray that these words have meant something to us, that we understand that you are engaged in the future. You're engaged in your plan for what you want to do for your people. But you've also given the plan for the world. And I pray, Father, that we would take and glean from these words, and that we would understand that really no generation is exempt from persecution. No generation is exempt from trials and even purging. But Father, I also pray that you prepare us, because the world is moving. We're moving to a destination, or moving to an end. And I pray that you prepare our hearts that first we would know you, that we would have a relationship with your Son, Jesus Christ, that we would call upon your Son as Lord and Savior. I pray, Lord, in my heart, those who are watching, those who are listening, that we choose to serve you. Father, that's our prayer. We just give this time to you in Jesus' name. Amen.